Hey guys, this is Mike from Eldorado Guitars, and today I'm here to talk to you about the new Friedman IR-D pedal, preamp pedal. Okay guys, so I'm making this video because I chose to return the Friedman IR-D, and I kind of wanted to go through the reasons that I chose to return it. And I'm going to try and make this really short and sweet. And I just want to start out by saying, you know, I love Dave Friedman and his amps. I think they're great. They're amazing amplifiers. I own 3 Friedmans right now. I've owned most of the amps in Dave's lineup at some point. I've owned a BE100, 2 of them I think. I've owned a BE100 Deluxe. I've owned a Wildwood Small Box. I've owned a Twin Sister. I've owned several Nakeds. I've owned a J.K. Lee twice. You know, so if you name it, I've kind of owned it in the Friedman line. I really just felt that this pedal missed the mark, and I kind of wanted to explain why. So first of all, what is this? Basically, every amp is 2 parts. It's 1 part preamp, 1 part power amp. So this is basically half of an amp. This is the preamp, and the idea is that you can either record this direct into a digital audio workstation, or you can run it into a bunch of other things like rack effects, power amps, the effects return of another amp, right? So there's a lot of different ways that you can use this preamp. Why did I choose to return it? The first reason really has to do with the response. So while the sound of the IR-D is pretty good, I did like it, mostly coming through the room, through the Friedman power station. When I plugged it into the line in of the power station, it sounded really good in the room. The sound on the DAW we'll talk about in a second, okay? But while the sound is really good, the response to me is not. Friedmans have a very particular response. They have that really like kind of slick, greasy kind of feel to them for the most part. They're pretty compressed, they're pretty refined. Some people say they sound produced. This pedal, while it does sound pretty good, the response of a typical Friedman is simply not there. I found this pedal to be very stiff, very dry under the fingers. It doesn't bounce back. You don't get any power amp sag or that smooth, slick kind of Friedman feel. You don't really get that from this pedal. You're also missing the harmonic content, right? So part of being able to turn a power amp up is the harmonic content. Now I want to be clear, I'm not diming my Friedmans. I always run the master on my Friedmans, generally speaking, at 4. And the reason that I do that is because Dave told me many times that the sweet spot on his amps is around 4. If you look in the Axe effects, the master is always generally set at 4 for Friedman amps, right? And Dave even told me that Jerry Cantrell, who's one of my favorite Friedman artists, uses his amp at 4. So I want to be clear, I'm not like diming my amps in here or anything, but when you open up the master of a real amp and you get the power section kind of cooking a little bit, you gain a lot of harmonic content. And you know, that's especially noted in Dave's amps since they're based on plexis. And if you've ever run a plexi, you know, at 10 dime, the harmonic content is like out of control, right? It's like all these beautiful overtones. There's a lot of like great natural feedback. You kind of get the same thing with a train wreck. And all of that is missing from this pedal. All that harmonic content is just not here. This is really dry, really stiff. It doesn't have that slick feel. The harmonic content is off. It's kind of missing. It's just not the same. I don't know what else to say. And I know people are going to say, oh, you're cork sniffing or whatever. And maybe I am. But the response on this is just not like the response of a real amp. Now it does improve a little bit if you plug it into a power amp. So when I plugged it into my PS100 that's behind me, it did improve a little bit in the room here, right? It did. It sounded better in the room because I got a little bit of the tube power amp kind of, you know, into the sound, and it did respond a little bit better. But what's the point of buying this thing if you've got to run it into a power amp and then record it? The purpose of this thing is that you can just plug it right in and go, right? And so it kind of seems like detrimental to the purpose. So, you know, feel is one of those things you can't really explain through a YouTube video. It's very hard. It's one of my biggest gripes with YouTube videos is like all you hear is the sound. You don't get to experience the feel under the fingers and the response in your hands of anything that I demo. So all I can tell you is that the feel and the response on these feels off to me. Next thing, regarding the sound. So while I did like the sound in the room when I was running it through the PS100 behind me, I did not care for the sound direct into the digital audio workstation. I ran this direct into my UA Apollo twin quad, and out of my studio monitors, I've got Yamaha HS8S. I found the sound of this to be very congested. It's almost like a really hot biased diesel. They get congested in the mid-range. It sounded really messy in the mids. There were a lot of frequencies that just weren't very appealing. Maybe that's the best way to put it, you know? Now again, when I ran it in the room, it improved, but direct into the DAW, I didn't really care for the mid-range. Like I said, it sounded like a hot bias diesel. Exacerbating that might be the IRs. The IRs that come stock in here, I don't particularly care for. Now I know I can go on the software and change them and all that stuff, but I'm just telling you that the ones that come on here, I'm not really crazy about. The top two are really woofy. They've got a lot of low end, and they're very scooped sounding. And then the bottom one is much more mid forward and tighter, which I liked, but you have to crank the bass. So like, it's like on the first two, you're turning the bass down all the way. And then on the last one, you're turning the bass up all the way. So I feel like the IRs are kind of all over the place on this as well, which might lend to some of the congestion that I hear in this pedal. You know, and I kept trying to solve the congestion. I kept changing the brightness switches, changing the structure switches, trying to do like more gain with a lower structure or less gain with a higher structure, or, you know, with bright switches on and off. I tried like taking the mids all the way down, taking the mids all the way up. I played with the amount of boost on the side, right? So I used a little screwdriver to turn that up. Unfortunately, that made it worse. Feels like the more you turn the boost up on this, the more congested it gets. So I actually suggest leaving these at the stock levels, even though the boost is very mild. I just didn't feel like the sound recorded direct was really all that. And again, in the room, it was better, but then what am I gonna do? Plug this thing into this thing and then go through the cabinet and record the cabinet into my DAW? It feels like you're defeating the purpose of this thing in the first place. So I didn't really care for the sound recorded direct. The third reason I'm returning it is kind of weird. It's the fact that this unit is ungrounded. So what do I mean by that? So here's the power adapter, and you'll see that it only has two prongs. It doesn't have the third prong, right? The bottom prong. The bottom prong is your ground. So this is an ungrounded unit. And it tells you that in the manual. If you look at the manual for the IRX, it will explicitly say this is an ungrounded unit. You'll experience additional noise unless you plug this unit into something else that's grounded. And it explicitly says, like, for example, if you use this for headphones for practice, like if I were to just plug this in, plug my guitar input in, and then headphones into my ears, you're gonna hear a lot of noise, and I did that. It's very noisy. But I was getting a lot of noise even in the room. When I was plugging this into the PS100 behind me, I was using my Les Paul, and you know how Les Pauls, when you take your hands off of them, they buzz a little bit because they're not grounded the same way as a Strat. It was like times 10, right? It was a lot of noise, a lot of grounding noise. And I just feel like that's very disappointing. I don't know why you would make an ungrounded unit. I assume it must have something to do with like the manufacturing, or maybe the preamp tubes that are in this, or the power supply or something. I don't know. I'm sure Dave could explain the technical reason why. I'm sure there was a reason, because Dave doesn't do anything without a reason. So I'm sure there was a reason for not grounding it. Maybe if you're doing like big rack systems or something, maybe you want an ungrounded unit. I don't know. But I'm telling you that if you're using it the way 90% of us are using it, it's going to be a little noisy. I just didn't really like that. It just seemed kind of silly for such an expensive unit to not have a grounded power supply. Feels like a really lame oversight, to be honest with you. So I didn't really like that there was a lot of noise coming from the pedal either. That leads me into kind of my last point, which is that this is relatively, and the last reason I'm returning the pedal, which is that this is relatively expensive in today's market. This pedal is like, what, $500, I think, right? Plus tax, possibly plus shipping. And I just don't feel like it's worth $500. I'm gonna be honest with you, I just don't feel like it's worth $500, especially now that the market has cooled off dramatically. For example, there's a guy in my city who is selling a Friedman twin sister for, I think, $2,000. I think, honestly, if you could get that guy to like $1,700 and you're saying, hey, it's another grand more than this, I would rather just buy the actual Friedman amp. that's gonna solve all these issues. You're not gonna have grounding issues, you're not gonna have congested in the mid-range, it's gonna have that Friedman feel and response, right? To me, that's worth that extra money, right, versus this. And with this, you've gotta have a power amp to plug it into anyway. And these things aren't cheap either. They're like $1,000. So this plus this is already almost the cost of just buying the real amp. So this is a pretty expensive unit in today's market. And I think at the end of the day, it really just still doesn't feel like a preamp to me. It feels like a pedal. It just feels like a pedal. And I mean, I know it is, right? It's a pedal, but I think they tried to market it as something more than a pedal. And it just doesn't feel that way to me. It still just feels like a pedal. I mean, I feel like if you took a BEOD and ran it into your interface and put an IR in front of it, probably gonna achieve 90+% of this sound for $100, right? So I just feel like the price premium on this is very, very, very high in today's market. Those are really the reasons I chose to return this pedal. And I hate to make these kinds of videos because, you know, I'd love to sit here and say to you guys like, oh, everything Dave does is awesome, because I love Dave's amps so much. But this one, I just feel like they really missed the mark on this one, you know, and I don't feel like anybody's talking about it. I haven't seen any of the other YouTubers mention a lot of these things, probably because they get paid to say how awesome it is, to be completely honest, right? I don't care about making money from YouTube. My channel isn't monetized. I don't care about making any money from YouTube. I do this to give you guys my real opinions, and I'm not paid. I bought this myself, right? I'm just giving you the real thing. So from a real player, right, and a real collector who, you know, has a lot of experience with this stuff, I would just hold off on this one, and I would buy a real Friedman amp instead. That would be my 2 cents. I would save your money longer, or, you know, sell an extra guitar, or whatever it is that you got to do to get a real Friedman. When you get a real Friedman amp, you're going to be really happy, and you're going to go, man, this thing sounds insane. And, you know, again, when you're talking about between this and buying this, and then versus buying a twin sister, you might as well, I think, just buy the twin sister. I chose to return this since I already have 3 Friedmans, and I would just, you know, check it out at a Buddy's or check it out at a store or something before you commit to it. Because remember, YouTubers can't tell you the response of any pedal or any amp or anything on YouTube, and nobody talks about the response. Everybody just talks about the sound. And while sound is great, what if you had an amp that sounded awesome, but you hated playing it? You were like, man, it's so hard to play. Then it would be called a wizard. Oh, okay, all right, sorry. Cheap shot, okay. But like, what if I was like, this amp is so difficult to play, but it sounds great, right? You probably aren't gonna be too crazy about that. And that's kind of what I think is going on here. Get a real Friedman, you'll love it, trust me, you'll thank me, I think. So I'm gonna go ahead and get this boxed up and sent back to Sweetwater. This is Mike from Eldorado Guitars, guys. Have a great rest of your day, and save up and buy a real Friedman. You'll thank me.